In this video, you will learn about the reciprocal of a number. Now we need to first determine what a reciprocal is. So our definition of reciprocal is two numbers whose product is 1. Another name for those two numbers would be called multiplicative inverses. For example, 6 and 1/6 are reciprocals because 6 times 1/6 equals 1. So because the product is 1, those numbers would be reciprocals. And then 3/4 and 4/3 would be reciprocals because when you multiply the two numbers, we get 1. We'd get 12 over 12, which is 1. All right, negative 1.25 and negative 0.8, for example, would also be reciprocals because when I multiply those numbers together, negative times negative is positive, and when I multiply these two, I get a positive 1. All right, 1 is its own reciprocal because 1 times 1 equals 1. So the reciprocal of 1 would just be 1. And same thing with negative 1 because negative 1 times negative 1 would be 1 as well. So the reciprocal of negative 1 would be negative 1. 0 would actually have no reciprocal because nothing times 0 would give you 1. Anything times 0 will always equal 0. Now this concept of reciprocals can be expressed in math notation as you see here. It says that for every non-zero real number a, there is a unique real number 1 over a, such that a times 1 over a, or a times the reciprocal, would equal 1, and the same thing, 1 over a times a would also equal 1. So the question is, how do you find that reciprocal? So here we have the number 8. Okay, 8, we can think of that as 8 over 1. That is the same thing, because 8 divided by 1 is 8. So the reciprocal, bottom line, is you are switching the numerator and denominator. So instead of 8 over 1, we would have 1 over 8. So 1/8 is the reciprocal of 8. And we can verify that because 8 times 1/8 would equal 1. All right, next we have the number 1. The reciprocal of 1, we first need to think of 1 as a fraction, which we can think of that as 1 over 1. That is the same thing. So the reciprocal would be switching the numerator and denominator. So if we switch the 1 and the 1, we still get 1 over 1, which would equal 1. So the reciprocal of 1 is 1. And we can verify because we multiply 1 by its reciprocal, which is 1, and it should always equal 1, which it does. Next we have a decimal, 0.25. So 0.25 is the same thing as 25 over 100, which would equal 1 over 4. So 0.25 is 1/4. The reciprocal would be switching the numerator and denominator. So instead of 1 over 4, we would have 4 over 1, which would equal 4. So the reciprocal of 0.25 would equal 4. Next we have negative 1. So negative 1, if we write this as a fraction, we can think of this as negative 1 over 1. So the reciprocal is switching the numerator and denominator. So instead of negative 1 over positive 1, we would have positive 1 over negative 1, which would still equal negative 1. So the reciprocal of negative 1 would be negative 1. And we can verify by multiplying the number by its reciprocal. Negative 1 times negative 1 would be positive 1. Next we have negative 4. Negative 4 is the same thing as negative 4 over 1. So the reciprocal, we would switch the numerator and denominator. So instead of negative 4 over 1, we would have 1 over negative 4, which would equal negative 1/4. So the reciprocal of negative 4 would be negative 1/4, and we can verify because negative 4 times its reciprocal of negative 1/4 would indeed equal 1. So now that we know how to find the reciprocal, we need to understand how to multiply with them. So here we have 1 over 3 times 1 over negative 6. Now remember, when you multiply fractions together, you multiply the numerators together and then multiply the denominators together. So on the top, we would have the 1 times 1, and on the bottom, we would have 3 times negative 6. 1 times 1 is 1, and then 3 times negative 6 would be a negative 18. Here we have negative 80 times 1 over 8. I can think of negative 80 as being negative 80 over 1. That is the same thing. All right, the negative sign can go either with the 80 or with the 1 or on the side. It's all the same thing. All right, so when I multiply, if we put the negative with the 80, we'd multiply the negative 80 times 1 on the top. And the bottom, we would have 1 times 8. So negative 80 times 1 is negative 80. 1 times 8 is 8. So my answer is negative 80 over 8, which would reduce to be negative 10. Now, by the way, there are shortcuts. We don't need to show all these steps every time. Right here at this step, anything in the top can reduce with anything in the bottom. So the 80 and the 8 could reduce. I can divide both by 8 to get 10 over 1. So I can see right here that I would have negative 10 times 1, which is negative 10, over 1, which is going to be negative 10. So at this point right here, I could have jumped from there to get to my answer of negative 10, or I could have gone through the steps and got the same answer. Next, we have 1/4 times parentheses negative 16a plus 20. So we need to distribute 1/4 times both of these terms. So 1/4 times negative 16a, and then plus 1/4 times the 20. So when I multiply the fractions, if I go through the long way, I would multiply the numerators together. So 1 times negative 16a over 4 times 1, which is 4. So negative 16a over 4. And over here, I have 1 times 20 on the top and 4 times 1 on the bottom. So negative 16 divided by 4, I can reduce that to get 4 over 1, or just 4. So this would be negative 4a, and then 20 divided by 4 would be 5. So my answer is negative 4a plus 5. I'm going to show you another shortcut here because it's going to save us a lot of time in the long run. When you think of fractions like this, 1/4 times these different numbers, we can think of this as being 1/4 of 16. So 1/4 of 16 is simply 16 divided by 4. So at this point right here, I could have seen very quickly 1/4 of 16 is 4, so we have negative 4. And then 1/4 of 20 is 20 divided by 4, which is 5. So it saves a lot of time if I realize that multiplying fractions is the same thing as dividing by the 4 in this case. All right, here we have one last example. And in this one, we are going to use that same exact thought process that I had for the last one with the fractions and multiplying. So first, make sure you do order of operations. So you work within the parentheses first. Notice here in this innermost parentheses, there's nothing that could combine. So that just stays there. All right, so what I need to do is within the brackets here, I need to distribute the 24 first. All right, so we have 24 times negative 1/3. So I can think of that as 1/3 of 24, which is 24 divided by 3, which would be 8. So that would be a negative 8. So that's where that negative 8 comes from right there. And then 24 times 1/4 means 1/4 of 24, or 24 divided by 4, which would equal 6. So I have 6, and then the x is there as well. So that would be plus the 6x. All right, from here, I can simplify. So within the brackets, 4 plus, and then adding this, you can basically get rid of the parentheses because you add a -8, which is just -8, and you're adding a 6x, which would just be the plus 6x. So I can just ignore the parentheses. I have 4 plus -8. Well, 4 plus -8 would be -4. All right, so here in brackets, I now have -4 plus 6x. And then this -1/2 outside of this is being multiplied by the brackets. So I take -1/2, multiply it by both terms inside. So negative times a negative would give me a positive, and then 1/2 of 4 would be 2. So that would be a positive 2 right there. Then -1/2 times a positive 6x, negative times positive would be negative. Then 1/2 of 6 is going to be 3. So that's going to be a -3x. And then lastly, I can combine like terms. We have the 3x right here, can combine with the -3x right here. 3x minus 3x gives me 0, which will cancel out. So my final answer is I'm left with 2.